Right, welcome back to another episode of Jak and Daxter remake on Unreal Engine 5. Over the last 2 weeks I've been working on getting the basic player input set up, and that's kind of what you can see I'm doing here. My goal was to set it up for both keyboard and controller, that way it was a lot easier for me to test it, but also kind of makes it a little bit more user friendly. I know this won't be tested by anybody else except for myself to kind of play it, but that way I don't have to have a controller always connected to the PC while working on this. Once that was all done, I could actually set up the enhanced inputs on the player and get set up all the basic player movement, the jumping, using the left thumbstick and the right thumbstick to kind of move the player around and look around. And that's kind of what I'm doing here, but I'm building them as mini functions to keep my code a lot cleaner towards the end of the project. And I'll be doing this for a lot more things, not just the movements, but while testing a lot of this and kind of building it out, I tend to build it all in the same event graph, and then I would take it and place it into functions and kind of collapse it and clean it up a bit later. When it came to the jump, it was very important for me to kind of study what the jump was like in the actual game. So I've taken the jump every time it reaches the peak of the actual animation, and that's what I've kind of used to measure where the player is on screen. As you can see here, what I'm doing is I'm scaling the actual capsule of the player in this instance to see kind of that same animation and kind of reference it for myself. And I kind of calculated then how far each jump has to be for the player and how high they need to travel each time. And that's kind of what I'm doing here with the setup, is scaling that capsule and its collisions to match a lot closer to the actual reference of Jak jumping in the game. Once that was all set up, I could adjust kind of detecting when the player was near, when it was on the ground, and whether or not I could double jump actually, or if I've just completed a double jump. It was very important for me to kind of reference the speed at which Jak also kind of ran and jumped and how far he would jump, so I would constantly be testing that and referencing that back into the actual game and kind of footage that I took off of the game, and to ensure that it's all matching as close as possible. And I was using this kind of spike pit on Geyser Rock as kind of my main measurement of how far Jak could jump across and kind of making it across, and that's kind of what I was aiming at getting to. Now you'll see I set up a lot of additional things, such as the crouch as well as the punch, and I did this by launching the character forward actually when it's punching, but when I'm doing that I'm also doing a line trace to detect what I am hitting as I am punching forward. And I think this is quite a good way of getting a lot more of an accurate detection. Once I have the animations, I will probably switch to tracing from one of the bones to ensure that I'm actually hitting the object right in front of me and not something off to the side. But for time of testing, this worked perfectly fine to kind of get it in so that I could start focusing on some of the actual bigger things in the game, such as break. Once the punch and the spin was also added, I could work a bit on the controls. Because I've mapped everything from the game and got all the controls from the game and how they work, I could rebuild them on my side. So this was simply to get a dolly kind of effect on the camera and moving it in and out and at a certain speed, and have it stop when it gets to a certain length. You'll see a lot of times that I keep deleting things and redoing things, and I kind of kept that in on purpose to show that it's not always kind of just straightforward, oh, this is how it works, but there is sometimes multiple approaches you could take to building some of these actual functionalities, especially in blueprints. And that's kind of what I've done here, is showing part of my debugging on building something as simple as dollying the camera where it doesn't work perfect each time, and kind of working around them until I get it to a very acceptable kind of area where I'm happy with how it reacts to me while playing. Another thing I realized when I was setting up the spin attack and testing it is that when you're playing the game and you kind of do a spin attack, you kind of have a bit of a delay, kind of hover effect as you get to the peak of your jump and then do the spin attack. And that was kind of what was important for me. So that's what I've done there, is as I get to the peak of the jump and I do a spin attack, I would reduce gravity, kind of just keeping Jak a little bit higher and kind of floating in the air before coming back down. For the breakables, I decided to go with, for me, the most complicated breakable, which would be the Scoutfly box, because Scoutfly boxes are conditional on how they're broken. They have to be broken down by a ground slam, and you can't just punch through them, but they also have to drop an item, kind of the Scoutfly. So I thought, well, let me start with that, and with them being animated as well, it adds another level of complexity. So that was kind of my first breakable that I was going to test everything on. So I jumped into Blender and started remodeling the Scoutfly by getting the original model, using that as reference for making the new one and adding some additional bevels and additional details which the previous one couldn't have had on, simply because of the limitations. Now I am taking a little bit of creative liberty on some of these things and adding like an additional pivot point for the handle as if it was attached to the box. But I'm trying to stay as close to the original as possible as well. Now when modeling it, I had to keep in mind that I had to actually keep the interior of the box. I couldn't make it empty because I want to use fracture inside Unreal Engine 5 to break these parts and actually have you interact with them instead of just having it as a particle effect. So I had to model the inside and keep kind of the UVs and everything to kind of ensure that I don't waste any textile density when it comes to texturing these assets, and that's what I've done. Once I could get it then into Unreal, I could do a quick test on how the actual fracture would work and how it would interact with the player when breaking it. And that's kind of what you can see here is me doing exactly that. Now I'm using a basic impulse to kind of fracture this, and I'm spawning it where the player impact, and then kind of breaking it and then setting up all the values to how long the pieces can survive after being broken before they kind of disappear and kind of fade out into the world. That way we can ensure that performance stays stable throughout the entire game as you're playing, and it doesn't go down the more you break things. Once that was done and I was happy with the result I was getting from the breaking, I jumped into Substance Painter, where I could then start kind of rebuilding this material for the Scoutfly box. Now, a lot of the colors that I pick are coming directly from the original, but I wasn't quite happy with the blue metal that they were using on the original, so I decided to go look for a bit more of a stylized, kind of hammered effect metal instead. Felt like it would be still quite nice and sturdy, but still lend itself to the original stylized kind of look. In order to add some additional highlights to the box as well, I've taken the curvature map and I've passed it through slope blur gradients as well, and I've set one to being black and one to being white, and I could fade them from the bottom to the top of the actual mesh, and that was kind of to add some additional highlights or some additional shadows on the mesh and kind of give it a gradient. But I try to stay as close to the original as possible as well when doing all of this, and not to stray too far in what I think it should be. So a big thing that is actually a positive in this is now that I can add some additional roughness and metallic kind of to these assets, because we're using Unreal Engine and it uses PBR. Even though we're going stylized, we can still add some additional roughness and metallic to the objects to kind of give them an additional layer of making them pop. But sometimes you can get away with some very simple stuff as well. And you can kind of see that when I get to texturing the rope, is that I didn't necessarily have to model the entire rope, because it's such a small part of the asset. I could just use a texture that was tileable to get it to wrap around the actual object, and that's kind of what I've done here. And I've just set it to be extremely matte for exporting it and getting it into Unreal. Once I was able to get it into Unreal, you can see that I'm referencing again, having a look at some of the animations in the game on how that's actually animated and how it moves. And I realized that, well, because it has to be a rigged mesh, is to use a couple of bones, but I've added additional bone for the actual handle because I wanted to add some additional animations to the handle as it's jumping along. Once I've added the actual bones inside Unreal, I could then skin them to the actual mesh and set it up. And a lot of this was going to be testing to ensure that I weight everything properly to the correct bone when it comes to scaling this object, because I yes, I do want it to squash and stretch when actually animating it, but I don't want pieces to be disconnecting, as you could see during the testing. So this meant going back and forth quite a lot, adjusting the weights and adjusting which vertices attached to which weight. Once that was done, I could create a physics-based object for the actual bone system, and this would allow the actual crate to interact with the player when it's in its skeletal form instead of doing it in its static form. Now the big thing was with this is that I would have two meshes basically overlapping each other, but one would be hidden and one would be shown. And when you're playing the game, you would be seeing the actual skin mesh and having that kind of be your main interaction point. And that's kind of what we're setting up here, is figuring out when to swap between the skinned and the actual fractured mesh to ensure that we as a player could kind of interact with it while it was animated in the playing in the world, versus when it had to swap off for the fractured one and kind of break apart, and how that would be set up. Once I got that all set up and I was happy with the way it was interacting, I could set up the actual control rig, and I set up a basic IK rig inside of Unreal using the control rig that comes with Unreal, and I was basically just taking the controls that I've added to the bones and setting the transform of those bones to those controls. It was quite a simple setup to do, but it got the results exactly like I wanted to. And this was again going back and forth and seeing like if I needed an additional root bone or a root control, I could just go add it. And because it's all done in Unreal, I didn't really have to re-import anything, and it was a lot faster to kind of just get it going and get working. Once I was happy, I could drop in a level sequencer and I could start animating the actual box. Now what I did was, on my secondary screen while I was animating this in Unreal, is I had a clip of the Scoutfly box actually jumping, and I could follow it frame by frame to kind of see how far it jumped, what the scale is, and kind of seeing how it squashes and stretches the original. And that's kind of just what I've done here, is I've copied it as close as possible from the original using footage. And once that was all done, I could add the additional kind of inputs, and you can see that here with the handle is how I'm animating that additional kind of details on top of what is already there, because of the kind of flexibility I have. Once I was happy with the actual animation, I could bake it out into an idle animation from the sequencer, which made it a lot easier for me to just play it while in the game. But I did realize, instead of adding a delay, I could extend the timeline to be roughly 6 seconds in total, from it being 1 second for a jump and then 5 seconds of idle before it jumped again. And that made it quite nice for me to just play one animation set the whole time without having to add additional logic to delay any animations, which would kind of hamper me down the line when I have more objects or breakables that have animations. Right, now that it was all done and kind of exported and kind of working the way I wanted to, I had to add new trace channels, and the trace channels was simply done because I was doing two traces, one when I was punching and one when I was doing ground slam, and depending on what you're hitting, they would have different reactions. Now with the Scoutfly box being ground slam only, I could add in a branch to detect whether or not the player is actually doing a ground slam, and if the trace comes back as true for the ground slam, we could break the actual Scoutfly box. But if we're punching into it, it would actually do a sphere trace by the punch channel, and that would detect that this is not a ground slammable object. Like it would have a key in it, whether or not it detects the punch or the ground slam, and that would be used then to calculate whether or not it should just break, or if it's even breakable in that sense. Now this took a lot of trial and error as well, and I realized later down the line that I was doing so many overrides on the blueprints that I was placing in the level while doing testing that things kind of started getting mixed up and complicated. So I would have one crate being ground slam only, but then I would have another crate which would be ground slam and punchable, and vice versa. So that's kind of what I'm doing here. As you can see, all the line traces that I'm doing is because I'm trying to detect when these collisions are actually being triggered and why they're being triggered. So a lot of this was debugging early on to see how it was going to work, and I added these as actual variables in the final template where I could actually activate when a object be broken, does it get broken with ground slam or does it get broken with punch only? And I think that's quite a useful thing, because when I create child blueprints from this breakable now, and that's kind of the final point of this whole breakable and the complexity of it, is when I create new blueprints, I can use this breakable as the parent blueprint for everything else, and that allows me to just set up the meshes, collisions, and actual emitters and sounds. And that's kind of what I'm adding here to that blueprint, is which additional things do I need on one blueprint, and that when I update that main blueprint, every breakable blueprint and instance thereafter would be updated to the same object, and I can kind of pre-make these and then just place them around the world. And that's what I've done, is once I've set up all the sound and the emitters and where they spawn, I was able to create a new scout fly, and then that allows me to place it in the world and kind of just get it on. So for the 2 weeks that I was working on this, it was quite a lot of progress in setting up all the breakables and making a system which allows me as a solo developer to kind of have that flexibility, but also save me time on setting up these breakables by having one main blueprint to kind of use for everything. And here at the end, you can kind of see it all come together, where it is breakable right at the end, and I can just do it with the ground slam, and you can kind of see the trace channels as well as the particles kind of spawning in. But if you'd like to see more, hit the like, hit the subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.